Hello and welcome to this episode of Quakerism. In this episode, we're going to be continuing the history series looking at the history of Quakerism. I've done quite a few videos in this playlist already, so please do check that out if you haven't done that, because we're going to be starting midway in 1660 with the return of the king. So the king in question is Charles II, who is returning as king for the first time. He was prince when he fled during the when his father was executed, and has come back as king at the request of Parliament following 10 years of republicanism under Oliver Cromwell. He died. His son Richard tried to keep it all together, couldn't, and so England was left in a situation where getting Charles II back was arguably the best course of action. And Charles II has quite a good rap when it comes to like general English life. I think if you were to ask, people who know him, I think if you were to ask ask people about Charles II, they'll say things like, "Oh, he was a jolly monarch. There was lots of fun and malarkey going on in the court. It was all fun and game. He just loved having fun." However, I think in the Quaker imagination, he definitely is kind of a bit of a bad guy. And we'll get into precisely why in this video, because things get dark. Before he came back, he made a statement at Breda, which is in the Netherlands, and in that, as well as sort of saying things like, there'll be a general amnesty for parliamentarians, for example, who fought in the Civil War. There wouldn't be like mass reprisals in any way. He also said that there would be freedom of conscience, which, I mean, I'm not a Charles II scholar, but seems to me, especially considering, as I said, Breda's in the Netherlands at this point was staunchly Protestant, that would mean that people who weren't Catholic, or I suppose in the British context, Anglican, then they would have freedom of conscience to not to carry on their denominational practices. But as it turned out, he didn't really follow through with this. Maybe he had all good intentions coming in and then realized the situation wasn't tenable when he, that could have happened as well. I'm open to the idea that he's not just a two-faced Quaker hating man, but that, he had good reasons for doing what he did. And I think there are reasons, which we'll go into as well, why I think he may have done what he did. So yeah, as I said, 1660, Charles II returns, and it's a dark year for Quakerism. So James Naylor also dies in 1660, following, it's without question that he died because of the result of the torture and the punishment that he receives following his trial and his ride into Bristol. As I said, check out the previous video to see what that was about. So that was a huge blow. As I said, up until that point, he was, arguably the more dynamic figure in Quakerism, and had he not ridden into Bristol, reenacting Jesus's re-entry into Jerusalem, and had he survived, and had which could have easily have happened had George Fox done something a bit outrageous, which he could have done, how would Quakerism have been different? Or would the same events that I'm about to describe happen as well? It's hard to know, but it's something that I think about every now and again. Another sad thing that happened in 1660 was the year that Mary Dyer was executed in Boston, in Massachusetts, not in England. And she was executed effectively for being a Quaker, simply for preaching as a Quaker. I believe this sort of period is the only time where Quakers are actively executed for being Quakers. But after that, Charles did say, "Let's not kill any more Quakers," which is nice, I suppose, apart from the fact that he did send a lot of them to prison, where a lot of them died anyway. So in fairness to him, Quakers weren't going to prison solely under Charles II. Quakers were going to prison, as we talked about, right from their very inception. The first Quaker to die in prison was in 1656. So, yeah, right from the get-go, really. But things started to decline quite severely after Charles II came back, and we'll talk about why now. The national mood towards Quakerism, shall we say, in that time was not great right at this point. As I've talked about before, they were misrepresented with other dissident groups of religious worshippers, most famously with the Ranters and the Fifth Monarchists. And following the Fifth Monarchist revolt in 1661, this led to basically the start of a real crackdown against these religious groups on the fringe of what was deemed acceptable by these 17th century establishment figures. So we're getting a growing antagonism, both from those in charge and just generally in the country, against Quakers, partially because of the more extreme groups, but also because of shooting themselves in the foot with the Naylor scenario. And Quakers had to react to this, otherwise they would at least be arrested, taken to prison, or certainly be killed. And so, what was their reaction to this? Generally, as I mentioned at the end of the last video, it led to a more less revolutionary. And I mean that word. I'll talk about why I'm using that word. So more revolutionary, less revolutionary Quakerism than in the early period. They weren't going around taking their clothes off anymore. They weren't predicting the end times as much as they were. George Fox and Margaret Fell still did. Holding the OGs holding out there. But for example, it's not mentioned at all in Berkeley's Apology, which we'll talk about later as well. So there was a reduced, shall we say, it was less extreme in terms of that they were predicting the end of the world. It was they were less extreme in their public image, shall we say. No more naked escapades anymore. So they focused more on the historical Jesus. And focusing instead, it's maybe a slight focus away from the inward light, and they limited the idea of perfectionism, that you could theoretically be without sin. This was kind of replaced with an idea that everyone had a measure of light that they had to live up to. So some had more, some had less. And so this didn't mean this meant that not everyone can achieve perfection. And Berkeley even said, well, actually, I don't know if it's actually possible at all. And lastly, and probably most importantly, a greater emphasis on central organization was put into place, and a collective responsibility was put on Quakers for the preachings and publications of individual Quakers. So no more could people just write whatever they wanted as a Quaker and it'd be fine. No more could basically Quakers took responsibility for the preaching and publications of other Quakers. This led, predictably, to a schism. Excellent. This is one of my favourite schisms. I mean, there's some doozies in Quaker history, but this one is good. So John Perrott was an Irish Quaker. Not many of those in the early days, so excellent stuff. And he had been imprisoned in the Vatican because he effectively, along with some others, tried to do a Mary Fisher and talk to the Pope and tried to get the Pope to renounce Catholicism and embrace Quakerism. And unlike Mehmet, the Sultan that Mary Fisher talked to, the Pope was having none of it, and so he was in prison. He was released eventually and was allowed to come back. And he was John Perrott was the hero. He was the dude. He took the Quaker message all the way to the Vatican, and fair play. I mean, I would be very impressed with that behavior. However, he had obviously not been in England during the whole Naylor incident and the whole sort of conservativizing of Quakerism, and he didn't like it. Didn't like it one bit, and he wanted basically it to be nice and free. Things like, oh, well, we'll have meetings for worship when the Spirit leads us, which I'm actually quite in favour of. But he didn't like that, set times at all. And the thing that he hated the most, which, as I said, just from a 21st century context makes no sense, but was a big deal in the 17th century, was the idea of hat honour. You've all seen the photos. Early Quakers loved a hat, and I think we should all still love hats. But anyway, they all had hats, and it's not just the Quakers. Everyone had hats back then. Hats were cool. But it was common practice, even amongst Quakers, that if someone was praying or giving ministry, I suppose, they would take their hat off in deference of God. And John Perrott didn't like it. John Perrott said, well, no, we should keep our hats on all the time. I'm not quite sure as to why. Because surely, if you're going to honour anyone, God probably would be a good place to start. But I'm not too sure. But effectively, he didn't like it. He said we should keep our hats on all the time, and just all with the hats. He was defeated by George Fox and the sort of centralists of Quakerism, and so hat honour was kept as long as hats remained a thing in Quakerism. I don't know. I've never worn a hat to meeting. What hat wearers today? What do you do if someone is giving ministry or praying? Do you take your hat off? Because George Fox says you should. But if you're more a Perrottist, then you do you. But anyway, so that was a big deal, and obviously not good when you're trying to get yourself together amidst upcoming persecution. But what John Perrott and that whole debacle was effectively around was the disagreement and resentment of growing centralization amongst Quakers, that the loss of this dynamism that is becoming stagnant, because a lot of the sort of fiery zeal was being taken out by these centralizing measures. Which I don't know. I personally, I just feel. I always feel it's a bit of a shame. I mean, I understand. I don't think they could have done anything different, and I think if Quakerism had stayed as radical as it was at its inception, it would have been persecuted out of existence. I don't think it could have survived. So I understand that the only reason why I could be a Quaker today is that these centralizing measures were put into place. However, I always feel sad. I always feel that's something that was lost there. And I think probably at this point it's probably 1660. Well, arguably you could say it's from the minute that James Naylor rode into Bristol. I think that is the end of the intense Quakerism, which probably could come back now and probably would be really cool. But we've got like 300 years of history of slightly more mellow Quakerism, and I quite like the mellowness too, I'm not going to lie. So anyway, that's where we are, and that's kind of why we are there. So the main sort of proofs, if you will, of this sort of centralization is the fact that George Fox was setting up meetings. Interesting though that London Yearly Meeting, so like what became the lead meeting amongst Quakers and effectively today became Britain Yearly Meeting, wasn't established until the late 1660s, so 1668. So that obviously became the main centralized body, along with Meetings for Suffering, which was established in 1775. Probably if you're going to talk about like Quaker centralization and its sort of most austere and most sort of repressive, I don't know, it doesn't have a very sinister name. And in fairness, it's not sinister. I'm thinking of it as sinister because I miss this sort of radical Quakerism. So it's called the Second Day Morning Meeting, which I think sounds so unsinister, and it's not sinister. I just imagine it as sort of like a sinister thing, keeping those kind of radical Quaker thoughts down. But I don't think there's a more perfect British bureaucratic body than Second Day Morning Meeting. And so quite a lot of Quakers' works were not approved by the second day morning meeting. And so I think some of them tried to publish it themselves, like sort of on the sly. But quite a lot of Quaker writings were suppressed this way. So Dorothy White, for example, who was I've been reading in early Quakers and their theological thought had some great things, and I just wonder how much theological thought we're losing by this meeting. But no, maybe that's by the by. So anyway, back to the repression. So kind of breaking with this word in my mind, but obviously makes sense in light of the Fifth Monarchist revolt. Charles II Charles II, the government introduced the Quaker Act in 1662. At this time, it's never good to have an act named after you. And also the Act of Uniformity. Now, what the Quaker Act did was banning Quaker worship and Quaker meetings, and the Act of Uniformity was a sort of blanket ban, and basically meant that there is only Anglicanism, there is nothing else. If anyone is doing anything else, then they are breaking the law. So obviously this led to a lot of Quakers being arrested, and because, as we said, they couldn't swear, they were sent to prison anyway. And there's these really I'm not sure if it's uplifting or sad stories, whether they're true or not, I don't know, of the Quaker meeting house being raided, all the adults being taken away, the children left, and the children still going to meeting by themselves, which is nice. I hope it's true. Roughly in the second half of the 1600s, about 11,000 Quakers are imprisoned, and I'm not sure if that's including, for example, George Fox was certainly arrested more than once, and what I don't know is he counted multiple times in that 11,000 roughly, or is he just one? Because 11,000 over the period is quite a lot of people. And of that, 243 people died, which I get is a small number based on 11,000 people, but that many people shouldn't really be dying in prison, really, I feel. And I don't know what they do about the woman who claimed to resurrect James Naylor whilst he was in prison. So is that 244 or 242? And so these were really dark times. So, following George Fox, for example, he's arrested pretty much everywhere he goes. Meetings are being disbanded. People are being arrested, and there's no form of formal recognition or formal protection of Quakers in any way. And so they have to do it all by themselves. So we come to 1675 then, so 15 years of brutal repression, and two things happen. One, another schism. Let's throw that in there. So this is the Wilkinson Story schism, which is less exciting because it doesn't involve hats, and it's effectively against, again, this growing centralization. I think they were particularly upset about women's meetings being set up. I'm not sure if it's because they wanted women in general meetings, and which, I think arguably today, I think people would prefer, or whether they didn't want women's meetings at all. I don't know. I assume probably the former. But anyway, so effectively, up until relatively recently, and certainly in the 20th century, I think, there were men's meetings and women's meetings. I think meeting for worship was together, but things like there was in London Yearly Meeting, for example, there was a London Yearly Men's Meeting, a London Yearly female women's meeting, which sounds a bit ludicrous and extra workload, but hey, that's how it was. But anyway, so they were against that, so that wasn't great. One thing that was maybe better in 1675 that Quakers established in that time was meeting for suffering, which has been disbanded as of this year. I kind of want to do a video about that because I wasn't able to go to this year's yearly meeting, and that kind of passed me by. And I'm a bit like, oh wow, because we're going to talk about meeting for suffering. It was a very big deal in this early period of Quakerism. So yes, from 1675 to 2024, this how it's been used has changed over that time, and I think this is what they're looking to do. They're wanting to repurpose the meeting for something different. But meeting for suffering sounds worse than it is. It sounds like, gosh, what's going on in that meeting? But effectively what it is, it's basically a way that Quakers can start to record and support those who are suffering because of their ministry. So they were reporting, Quakers in prison, Quakers who have become destitute, or Quakers who, all of these things. There was a record of it, so that then support could be put into place. So all for meeting for suffering, really. So I think you get kind of a general sense that this is a group under siege, really, and in that sort of siege atmosphere, a couple of things can happen. Either you stick to your guns and you sort of isolate yourself from the world, or you kind of adapt in order to fit in with the new scenarios. And to be honest, I would say that Quakers do both. So I think they do become entrenched in their beliefs, but I think the beliefs they become entrenched with are the ones that are sort of the compromised beliefs that I was mentioning before. So a slightly more greater reference on the historical Jesus and the Bible. Less nudity, less perfectionism, less eschatology and the end times and all of that, and collective authority. And and became very sort of isolated, and as a sort of peculiar people, they called themselves. Peculiar had a different meaning there, meaning like chosen, not strange. Although that's when the idea of Quaker dress and plain dress started coming out. Margaret Fell was dead against it. She called it a poor gospel, which is interesting because it was very prevalent until very recently. So obviously she was ignored. But I don't have any real main feelings about plain dressing, but I think it's interesting that she was against it. And I think she was against it because I think she just saw it as like a tradition, as something that, the whole point about Quakerism was breaking free from the traditions of man. And having a Quaker uniform is obviously, well, there's nowhere in the Bible about that. So we've talked about also as well about how this was a time when Quakers were constantly having to define themselves. And so this continued going into the 18th century, the idea that Quakers had to constantly go back and say, no, we don't believe this, no, we don't believe that. And by so doing, obviously, you're narrowing down what you do believe to a very specific point, which is where we end up with when we go into the 18th century. Something that really helped with this was the publication of the Apology by Robert Barclay, which, as I said, I promise I will do a whole deep dive on for all the fans that are clamoring for that. So I will have a look at it. But that was published in 1676, and I've just written 1676. Yes, I've made notes. As an aside, I don't actually, maybe you noticed, I don't actually have a script Quakered Up episode because I kind of feel like it should all just be extemporaneous, it should all just be but I've kind of had to for these history ones just because there's too many dates and I'm terrible. So I've written 1676 down. I will write down there if this is, because it was first published in Latin and later published in English, which I think is such a lad move. I mean, if I could publish a book in Latin first, I'd do that. Leave everyone guessing who can read Latin. Anyway, and the reason why this book is so important is because it is effectively what Quakers turn to a lot to kind of define what Quakerism is and what the theological position of Quakerism is, because at this point we start to get the theology of Quakerism starts to, you don't get massive Quaker tracts like the Apology again, really, for a long time. And so this became the standard. I've talked about this, that, in another video, that if a Quaker theological book is called the New Apology, then that's like massive praise in Quaker publishing because it was the book for so long. Some downsides on the Apology is that it has been argued that because of his Calvinist background, sort of Puritan thought comes into the Apology maybe more than maybe other Quakers would have done if it were them that were writing it. I don't think that's necessarily true. Certainly, he was against strange things, but then this was what it was like in that time of Quakerism. They didn't go to the theatre. They didn't like music. It is the Quaker tradition, but I think it's probably Quakerism coming from the Puritan strain rather than an actual Quaker position. So there is that in that, but that's like the last chapter. Just ignore it. And then apart from that, I think he does go out against Calvinist teaching as much as he does against Catholicism. So I don't think that's necessarily too fair, personally. Obviously, the Quakerism that he's talking about doesn't exist today, but the impact that it's had on Quakers throughout our histories cannot be denied, and so it's really important. So that was 1676, and it came out, as I said, to sort of combat the constant attacks that Quakers were coming over by being labelled this, that, and the other, which they weren't. Moving on into the 1680s, so we're nearly at the end of the persecution now. I want to talk briefly about William Penn. Now, William Penn was a nobleman who was convinced of Quakerism and was a close friend with the Duke of York, who would be the future James II. Tragic story for William Penn and that scenario. But anyway, all's good. So he was quite chummy with both Charles II and James II. And there's a delightful story. Again, whether or not it's true or not, I don't know. But I will tell it now because I think it's nice. As we know, Quakers have a thing about hats. And they don't take off their hats. Well, according to John Perry, you never take it off. Maybe you sleep in it, who knows? But you certainly don't take it off, even to a king, which at this point, like, that's like spitting in someone's face. It's like so rude. And so let's paint the scene, and I'll take you over to the story. So this is with Charles II and William Penn hanging around at court. And it goes like this. One day, Charles entered a crowded chamber in Whitehall Palace. As was the custom, every lady curtsied and every gentleman bowed and removed his hat. Except for one, William Penn, the Admiral's embarrassing Quaker son. Determined to make his point for his faith, William remained upstanding, his hat firmly on his head. Charles stopped before him, pointedly taking note of what could be considered treasonous defiance and could, too, be rewarded with a quick trip to the Tower. Then the king slowly removed his own hat. This was not what anyone expected, including William himself. Friend Charles, William said. Imagine addressing a king as Friend Charles. Good Lord. Anyway, Friend Charles, William said, with even more daring, why dost thou not keep on thy hat? Unperturbed, the king answered, because it is the custom of this place that only one man should remain uncovered at a time. Smashing. Absolutely smashing. It better be true. Anyway, so really good busy mates with Charles II and James II, and because of that, Quakers kind of had an in at court. Not that it really helped with the persecution, but and I think William Penn did spend some time in jail, so he wasn't like completely didn't get a free spin at all. But anyway, he was given the state of Pennsylvania, which he got to name, which is nice. So Pennsylvania, so the wooded country of Penn, lovely. And I think somewhere in Jersey, it wasn't New Jersey. I think it was West Jersey. I'll write it there. Anyway, but less said about that. More about Pennsylvania, because this was very important to Quakers, because this was a chance for Quakers to have a Quaker place, which, considering the time I've been talking about, was really important. So it was called the Holy Experiment, where there would be no persecution of religion, of different religions, and it would have, it would be Quaker led, but not in a despotic way at all. Very friendly. And William Penn went there, and and I think that carried on as a mainly Quaker colony all the way up until the French and Indian Wars in the sort of, I think, latter half of the 1700s. Now, it has to be said that it's not all perfect. Slaves were kept in Pennsylvania. William Penn had slaves. I think he felt bad about it, but he never got rid of them. So that has been criticised. But I think the idea that there was a Quaker state is quite exciting, and certainly was very nice for Quakers at that time. And so I'm assuming, I don't know, but I'm assuming there was quite a lot of people who did move to avoid that persecution to Pennsylvania. So in 1685, James II succeeds to the throne, so Charles II dies. So Quakers probably feel quite good, maybe, about that. But James II obviously brings his own difficulties, which we won't go into. But we have two major acts which basically relieve pressure on the Quakers. So we have the Declaration of Indulgence in 1687 and the Act of Toleration 2 years later in 1689. The Act of Toleration is seen as like the final kind of no more persecution, no more imprisonment for and an allowance for Quaker worship as well. I think, though, I haven't been able to find this out, though I think in order to be included in the Act of Toleration, Quakers had to uphold to a Trinitarian position, which I think I've talked about before. The ideas of whether or not Quakers were Trinitarian is kind of debatable. I think there were some that were more Trinitarian than others, but I think it's not. I don't think it's adverse to the Quaker position at all. So I think supporting that, I think it kind of, as I said, it kind of helps going down the more Quakers becoming maybe a bit more traditional in their Christian language, which was something certain that we will see going in the 1700s and the 1800s. But I think fair enough if you can be included in that, and that's something that you have to do. And even if you might personally have some things against that, then I think that's something that you would do. And final helpful law was in 1696, which was called the Affirmation Act, which meant that you didn't have to swear in a law court. So all those Quakers going to prison because they weren't swearing in court didn't need to anymore because they could simply affirm, which is excellent. One thing that we do have to talk about that happened in this time as well is quite important. Another schism. There aren't so many after, until the 1800s, in which case there's a lot. But this is the last 17th century schism, and it's called the Keithian Controversy, and that was in 1692. Now, George Keith, and like with John Perrott, was a big deal. Like, he was a big Quaker, a weighty friend. And basically his deal was that he thought that Quakers were focusing too much on the inward light and the kind of spiritual Jesus, and not enough on the historicity of Jesus and the Bible. And at this point, I mean, he did it in quite a lot of underhanded ways, and there was a lot of toing and froing and lots of underhandedness. So it's not necessarily, I think on both sides, it's not like that was all George Keith's fault, but I think it was also made difficult that this was happening over in America. But London Yearly Meeting, right the way through the 1700s, had quite a lot of oversight over the Quakers in the colonies as well, and so I think that helped sort of get messages crossed and people upset. But eventually he was he was removed from the Religious Society of Friends. He set up his own Quaker group, and then eventually became an Anglican. So but just to showing that this is still going on, that this friction that Quakers are noticing, that in a way we still feel today, between where do we prioritize ourselves? Do we prioritize ourselves as people of the Spirit or people of the historical Jesus? And that is a tension which you could argue still exists today. But it's interesting that it was the view of that Quakers need to be more focused on the Bible was the view that was ousted when, as we'll see when we go into the 1700s and 1800s, that's the view which becomes primary in Quaker life. We'll maybe do a separate video on the Keithian controversy because it is quite interesting. Early Quakerism is normally said to end, well, I suppose you could do it in many ways, but I think generally, if you're being broad, is said to end in 1723, and that's with the death of George Whitehead, who lived a really long time. I mean, he was there right at the very beginning, and I think he was very young at the beginning. But anyway, he was very old when he died, and so he was the last first generation Quaker to die. And so I suppose by the time we get to 1723, where's Quakerism now? Well, for the most part, it's in a lot better position in many ways legally than it has been, so not being arrested anymore. We can affirm in law courts. Our meetings aren't being disrupted and people arrested all over the place, just leaving the children to get on with it. We're taking off our hats still when we worship God, but not if we're talking to the king. I'd say that Quakerism is, because it's sort of had to hunker down, it has lost a lot of its sort of dynamism of the early days. It's been replaced with something that's more acceptable. And you could argue whether or not that's great, right or not. But as I said, it's something that has allowed Quakerism to survive in a way that it certainly wouldn't if the Quaker position stayed the same. So all these schisms, like the William Story schism and the John Perrott schism, against this encroaching centralization, yes, I sympathise. But at the end of the day, there would be no Quakerism if these things weren't done. I will always remain an enemy, however, of the second day morning meeting, because it just sounds so like pernicious. I don't like it at all. So not a fan of that. But otherwise, I understand what they're doing. They're talking less about the spiritual Jesus and they're starting to have a greater responsibility for individuals, so that they couldn't just say that they've been led to do whatever they want. There has to be collective responsibility. They're not talking that the end time is coming. So in the introduction to Quakerism by Ben Pink Dandelion, he kind of talks about instead of people of the end time, they're kind of people of the meantime now. So they don't think the end time is nigh. They think they're sort of preparing themselves, and sort of, again, it fits in with their sort of hunkering down like in their bunkers, waiting for the end time, instead of thinking that it's upon them right now, which is what the early Quakers believed. They thought that Jesus had come and this was the second coming, whereas it was now, let's just hold each other closely, let's keep out of everything else, and we just prepare. So a very different sort of outlook. It was, in terms of its structure, Quakerism had become a lot more centralized, as I said. So the systems and the groups and the bodies that we recognize now, so Britain or London Yearly Meeting, Meeting for Sufferings, area meetings, and all this sort of the structure of Quakerism was set up in this period that we've been talking about today. And women's meetings have been set up as well. And as I said, you can argue whether or not that's more equal or less equal. I think for the time, obviously, I think it was very radical, but I think today it's a bit of a strange one. Also, something that happened right at the end of the 1600s was that George Fox's journal was published and was widely popular amongst Quakers. And I think this is interesting, because I think this starts another trend of Quakerism where there is a growing respect for the early friends, the originals, to the point where if you're looking to read theological texts, instead of reading theological texts per se, they would read the journals of the early friends. And so I think this is why the early friends get the status that they get right from that very beginning, not only as the founders, but because of these proliferation of their journals, that people were able to really feel they knew what George Fox, what William Penn wanted from Quakerism, and they could set that as their standard. So there we are. So we're now into the 1700s, and in the next video, we're going to be looking at the period which is known as Quietism, a much maligned period in Quaker history. But we'll be looking at we basically will be looking at the next 100 years of Quakerism from now. So from the death of George Whitehead in 1723 all the way up to the massive schisms of the 1820s in America, and what led to that, how that happened, and what is this Quietism, and is it as bad as Rufus Jones said that it was? Thank you very much for joining me, and I look forward to taking you on that next part of the journey when that next video comes out. So I'll see you again soon.
Thank you very much for watching the video. If you liked it, please do click on the thumbs up and the subscribe button to get more videos about Quakerism in the UK today. It really does help, and thanks once again.